TV show. Hello and welcome to the Hype TV show Sunday Hangout. My name is DJ Novel Gordon. Tonight we're talking about how Black lives still matter. Tonight I have Naeem Holman from 28names.com and the Hype TV show host Courtney Pulliam. Later on we'll have Kahisha Zebley, 15-year-old veteran police officer, joining in the conversation. First, I would like to say thank you to my guest host and to our viewers out there watching us. I'm really passionate about this topic today, so let's just jump right into the conversation. My first question is, with all of the media around, all the different people who have been unarmed and murdered by police officers, it seems to be that there's a part of the conversation that's missing. It appears that African American women or other women of color, their stories aren't being brought to the forefront of the conversation, or they just aren't receiving as much attention. So my first questions to my guest host is, why do you think that is so?
All right, I think I can speak to that a little bit. For those of you who aren't familiar, my project is called 28 Names, where I took 28 individuals of color who lost their lives due to violence, and pretty much spread awareness about their deaths throughout the month of February, particularly February 14th. Now, most of my list comprised of young men of color who were victims of police brutality and ultimately died from their injuries. And one of my friends, I was in college at the time, one of my peers asked me how come I didn't have as many women of color on my list. To give you a rundown, I have, like I said, 28 names, or 29 names. On my list, I have Lavina Johnson, who was Army, she was in the military and her death was ruled a suicide, but her family strongly believes that she was raped and killed to cover up the rape. I have Hadia Pendleton, who was a victim of gang violence in Chicago. Also have Renisha McBride, and I believe that is all. Oh, and Rakia Boyd, who, as many of you may have heard, her killer, Officer Dante Servant, was cleared of all charges. Now, in doing my research, I'll be perfectly honest with you, it was very hard for me to, come across as easily articles about women of color being killed by police. And I think it may be fair to say that, more often than not, the men are the targets. But that, needless to say, that doesn't exclude the women, because there are quite a multitude of women of color that are being killed by police. Particularly, one case that stands out to me is Ayanna Stanley Jones. I believe she was either 6 or 8 years old by the rate of warrant. So it's really unfortunate that women don't get as much, and I think that a part of the problem is, one, coverage, and two, simply it may not happen as often to them.
I definitely agree. I think that there are a lot more men being targeted or being harmed by police officers. However, as we have this Black Lives Movement, I think it's very important that we include the lives and the voices of the women, because Black women have come out to support Black men
Absolutely.
throughout this struggle, and it's really unfair and upsetting to know that in return, when we are being harmed, or when we are being assaulted or even murdered, that we don't get the same attention. I know it may not be a reflection on how the community feels. However, the community has to respond regardless if that's shown on air. The media may be controlling that image, and they may be the reason why the images are being put out there. But as a community, we still need to come together equally when we hear cases like Natasha McKinnon or what happened to Miss Boyd. Courtney, what do you think? What do you think it is?
I think it's a kind of like a combination of what you all are bringing. Even with unless it's posted, like you said, it's hard to come across. I mean, like you mentioned, it's hard to come across some of those female incidences. It's just more. I don't know if it's always been more of just thinking about how media portrays certain things, where with males it's more extreme than it is for women. Like even when it comes to different cases, like if we not even look at the Black Lives Matter movement, but even with the domestic abuse, like what just happened with Brittany Garner and her assault on her partner, how even though it's a similar situation where it's abuse versus the Ray Rice situation, with the male is more, there's more uproar about it versus with the female. So I think it goes back to just what the media picks and chooses to show, and how more so when it comes to kind of like the male, when it comes from a male background, it's more dramatic versus for females. And it kind of goes back to the history of what it has been in the United States, period.
And I think a part of that may be some gender inequality in this country. I think that
Yeah,
it shows up
exactly.
that here we have, we're fighting for Black Lives Matter, and then women aren't equal in the fight in the sense that we aren't being represented. Naeem, you had a question or a comment?
Yes, I do agree with that, and it's very unfortunate. And as you said, not only are women very visible in the Black Lives Matter movement, it was actually started by three queer women. The Black Lives Matter movement was started by three queer women, and that goes to show how invested women of color are in the movements to end police brutality and to end violence against people of color. And I think with that realization, a lot more focus is being put on realizing these cases against women with police violence. So I really think that we're getting there, but we're not there yet. And I honestly do think that it's starting to turn the tide a little bit more, where the cases regarding women and police brutality are getting more publicity, visible.
Yeah, and although there are more cases of males than females, or that may just be an assumption. It may appear to be more cases of males than females just because the females is underrepresented. But I think that one of the ways that the Black family is attacked is through separation, and this could be a tactic to completely separate us again. So here we are trying to stand up for our rights, trying to stand up for our lives, and again, there's a divisive mechanism in the middle, and that divisive mechanism is keeping underrepresented women and how they're being assaulted, um, assaulted or murdered throughout this Black Lives Matter movement. Now, the other question I want to ask you is that it appears that police brutality has increased within the African American community, and I'm not quite sure that's true. But with that being said, do you think that people are becoming desensitized to Black men being murdered because it's constantly on the news? For myself, I feel like people are either desensitized or becoming paralyzed. It's kind of like, one, they feel like, oh, there's nothing. I had a conversation with someone, and they said, well, there's nothing that we can do. And then people feel like it's happening so often. Well, it's almost like, oh, well, those men must be doing something. People don't even want to believe that this is really an issue in our communities. What do you guys think about that?
I think it could be a combination of things. I think what's happening is there's, with the incidences that are occurring, is also being posted with other like normal homicides that are coming on. So it's kind of like, if you think about how it's presented in the news, it's kind of like this happened, oh, this happened, and this happened, this happened, this happened. So we are kind of getting overflooded and bombarded in a sense with what it is, and what's not being looked at separately with have it. And I can see how, just in conversations that I've had with some people, that it is in a sense being desensitized, because you had the movement that was strong for the, if you think about this year, for the first couple of months this year, and now people have just gone like, okay, well, it keeps happening, well, what else can I do? But not realizing it's an ongoing battle, like with any movement or anything that's happening in this world. It's a consistent thing, and it's not going to be changed right instantly. As if you happen to get to watch the show that Sergeant was able to speak on, it's a consistent fight and a struggle that will have to keep on moving, and people have to see that right away you won't see change. It's going to be something over time, and we have to stay together in that sense.
Naeem, your response?
Yes. Yeah. In regards to that, it is a lot. I definitely found myself just feeling drained and overwhelmed, reading up on all of the cases that I posted on 28 Names. I followed through with everything that was coming up. I literally followed everyone who was a notable social media account during everything that was happening in Ferguson, and they would post accounts about different cases of police brutality throughout the country. So it was just like an oversaturation of that kind of information, and it got to a point where you just like I honestly felt like I needed to step back from it because it's draining you because after a while, like the first time you hear about it, obviously you're upset about it, and then that anger increases with the second time, the third time. But when it gets to like the 12th time and the
or
13th
or
time or
the
even the
28th
20th time,
time or more.
exactly, you don't feel like you have any more emotion to give. So I can understand when people just feel genuinely drained and just like not understanding what to do. But I think I was able to use that energy as motivation to keep going because nothing's going to be solved overnight. Things just don't change because we decide to march from one part of the city to another. That those marches are for raising awareness about this for people who may not think it's as serious of an issue as we do. But things are not going to be, a quick and easy fix. And I think that's what a lot of people are now realizing or have yet to realize. And that's why they're getting so disillusioned with, hearing it every day. But I do think it has a good and a bad effect hearing it every single day. People are now realizing like, wow, maybe there's something to this Black Lives Matter movement, but then it may also kind of deter people and just like they tune it out because it's just too much.
Yeah, for
I
me,
think
I
so too.
realized that I have a little PSTD from, the news. Whenever I live in a suburban neighborhood, and I have a brother, and whenever I see it's late at night and I see a group of cop cars, my first instinct is to text them, "Where are you? Where are you and your friends?" And and I didn't realize I didn't realize how often I did this until the other day. I was like, wow, this has really impacted me on an unconscious level that now is changing my behavior. And it can be overwhelming, but I think that one of the first steps that we have to do is to continue to have the conversation. Naeem, you said a really good point. Having marches are very important because it increases the awareness of it, but the action cannot stop there. So do any of you have any comments on what's happening in your community now, or what people can do in their everyday lives to, to basically stop the abuse against African American males, African American females, and other people of color, or any other injustice that we are experiencing from police. And we just had Kaisha Zebli join our call. Welcome, Kaisha. She's a 15-year veteran as a police officer. And Kaisha, I don't know if you were able to hear, but my question was, we started off talking about how women are underrepresented in the community, and then we just started talking about how people are maybe feeling tired and desensitized or maybe paralyzed. So my question to Courtney and Naeem was, is there anything that people can do to start to make change in our communities against the abuse or the injustice that we are experiencing in our communities, particularly when it comes to unarmed people of color by police officers? Kaisha?
Sure, I agree with Naeem. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
You speak a little louder, please.
Hello there, can you folks hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me. So I was able to catch a bit of what Naeem was saying about how it started to become a little bit overwhelming when you delve into one incident after another. It seemed like they just started to be separated by days, and not weeks and months as they had, it seemed like, over the last couple of years. But one thing that I will say is, yeah, I believe that there's an opportunity for us to start to get desensitized and get a little bit overwhelmed by what's happening. But the one thing that I think we can do more immediately, Courtney mentioned that there probably needs to be a little patience. There are some things that aren't going to happen immediately. And certainly that's true. But let's think about some of the things that we can do that can be a little bit more immediate. Perhaps we can have a conversation with some of the young folks that seem to be most impacted by what we see happening nationally. What's the common denominator when when these incidents happen with the police. Oftentimes we see young men either fleeing from the police when they're attempting to stop them on an investigation, whether it's a vehicle stop or they're attempting to investigate them while they're a pedestrian on the street. Whether these interactions are legitimate or not, whether the initial interaction by the police officer is lawful in your eyes, if it's legitimate, like I said in my interview on the Hype Show, that's not the time to address it. What you need to do first is stop. The police are more than likely going to, quote unquote, win. And what we keep seeing in so many of these interactions is the number one thing that I keep seeing happening is that there is a subject fleeing from the police or resisting. I truly believe that many of these interactions, our young people are truly afraid.
Yeah, Kaisha,
They're afraid
Kaisha,
of these interactions.
what-
Hmm.
and that's the thing. Like I hear what you're saying that there has been this undertone lack of respect for police officers. So when you want to question them and feel like you're equal, and I guess what you're trying to say is that they are still in a position of power. However, if I'm a young man
Right.
and I'm being pulled over and I feel like it's unfair and in this environment that's happening, I don't
Hmm.
know if I would stay, not because I'm trying to be disrespectful, but I might really just be afraid for my life. So what's your response to that?
Okay. Unfortunately, some of what you're saying is cutting out, but I get the gist of what you're saying. And I truly do. I'm not just empathizing. I can say for certain that I know that a lot of young people, when they are stopped by the police, they truly are afraid. They're not certain if that interaction is going to end up with them being injured, if they're going to be alive at the end of the interaction. I believe that. I'm not even just sympathizing or empathizing. I truly, in my heart, believe that. But
Mm-hmm.
the one thing that you can't overcome really is the authority of the police. And I'm saying this as a police officer, and I'm also saying it as a citizen. I'm saying it as a mom. I'm saying it as an aunt of 4 young black boys who I have this same conversation with daily. I'm saying it as a human being. You have people with guns and badge of authority, and they are more than likely going to have the end of an interaction go the way that they intend for it to go.
Mm.
So the
And
most
that's true,
immediate
but
thing that you can do is if you're stopped for investigation, if I can give you a perfect example, and I think Dejanaba, you and I had this conversation the other day. I was stopping a male who was shoplifting. He wasn't a young male. He was middle aged. He was being investigated for shoplifting, and he was handcuffed. We hadn't been able to view the security cameras initially to see if he was indeed the person that was involved, but the store security they they told us he was involved. He had some things on him that he had not paid for. He couldn't produce a receipt, and this man began to urinate on himself and cry unconsolably. And I know for a fact that he was truly afraid that
yeah.
his interaction was going to go bad. And all I could do as not only a police officer, not only as the supervisor on scene, but as a black woman who has brothers and nephews who I know have been in very similar situations, all I could do was say to him, listen, you are likely going to be arrested. Right now, your resisting is going to make this interaction more difficult. I know that you're afraid, but you are not going to be harmed. You're under arrest. You're being investigated and more than likely, like I said, going to be arrested. But this interaction is not going to go bad for you. All I could do as a human is reassure him.
Well,
And
it's
like I'm,
great.
the
It's
point I'm trying to make is the point I'm trying not to cut you off, but the point I'm trying to make is if our young men stop thinking that the number one thing they can do when they encounter the police is to run, because the mindset of a police officer is if this male is running, say that I'm out investigating a robbery, say that there's a robbery that just occurred. If I'm investigating that robbery as a police officer and the store employees say that the person that robbed the store was a young black male, middle 20s, had a black hoodie and jeans. Well, that's half the young kids that are walking around in West Philly or, North Philly or wherever you may be encountering someone. you come across a male the minute you turn a corner in a police car and they take off running. The mindset of a police officer, whether it's right or wrong, is indifferent at this point. They think this person matches the description of a robbery that just occurred. This person very likely is armed. The shop owner said that there was a gun involved. So you got to think like a police officer thinking at this point. They think I might be a threat to them, and they're going to
I
treat
think
me like
I
a
think
threat.
that Kaisha, I hear everything that you're saying, and I think that we do have to start to change our perceptions and maybe change some of our behaviors when we interact with police officers and maybe not running. However, I think that maybe we also need to try to retrain the police officers and how they're thinking in that moment. But I know that Naeem had a comment that he wanted to respond to some of the things that you were saying.
Right. First and
Okay, Naeem,
foremost,
I'm here.
yeah, thank you, Kaisha. It's great to have someone who's in law enforcement actually speaking on this topic. You know, all too often a lot of these conversations that I have are one-sided. So I do want to thank you for that. With
Yes,
that
thank you,
said,
Kaisha.
in regards to the story that you told, I definitely understand, you know, why you felt the need to reassure him because of your own experiences and the people that you hold close to your heart. But unfortunately, there aren't a lot of I haven't found that there are many police officers that would do such a thing. You know, and
Yeah,
they're
that's not
Hmm.
the typical story that we're hearing on the
right,
news. Even if
Right.
somebody's running
Hmm.
away, they're getting murdered. But
right.
go ahead, Naeem.
Yeah, and I actually have a story of my own. I have a friend of there's a friend of mine who actually also was living in Philadelphia at the time. College graduate. He's actually pursuing his Juris Doctorate right now. He got out of his car and parked his car um, not too far from his apartment, but he had to cut through a little park that was very poorly lit. And as he's walking through, he hears freeze, and he sees what appears to be a gun pointed at him. His first reaction was to run, not because he did anything wrong, but because it was poorly lit, and he wanted to be somewhere where people could see him, and it was well lit, and they could see what would happen. Because if he felt if he had stayed there, something would have happened to him and things would have gone horribly wrong. And who knows, maybe I wouldn't be able to speak to this person to this day. You know, so there are ingrained fears that isn't from just this generation or isn't just from our parents' generation from like the 80s and the 70s. This has been multiple generations of like honest distrust of the police, and that's what we need to break. And I think Janaja had mentioned that earlier, and that's something that we really need to focus on. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Um,
It's okay. It's
that's,
okay.
yeah, but that's something that we really need to focus on both the community side and the law enforcement side. But that conversation isn't being had. If anything, the community and law enforcement are being pit against each other. You know, and I think
Hmm.
that's in part that's on behalf of the two communities and on law enforcement. So if once we can, I mean, not law enforcement, but the media, you know, law enforcement, the community, and the media, all three of those entities work to kind of pit the people and the police against each other. Once we can actually have these conversations and honest conversations in open forums, then we can proceed. But I honestly don't see that happening right now
What I not
until
yeah, not
until
to
we hit a
cut you
tipping point.
I think one
No,
thing
you're
that
fine.
people will see on next week's episode, in part two of I Still Can't Breathe, is Sergeant Zebley made a great point about how what the next steps are, with kind of redoing, like restructuring those relationships that are from. So you're seeing a lot of commissioners now coming forward, especially the police commissioner of Philadelphia, trying to make valid efforts with re establishing the relationship with law enforcement with the community. But I think even going forward, just some of those conversations are initially good, and I think just to start as a starting point outside, like we were mentioning, like marches are good for awareness, but as far as actual actions that we can take as two communities kind of coming together to really attack this issue. I think Sergeant Zebra, like you mentioned, starting those relationships, starting some of those training programs with the police enforcement, with the community, and also having some type of recruitment. Because if you're thinking about where some of these police officers are serving in the areas that they're serving, they're not representation of the target population that they're serving. It may be having more efforts of police enforcement coming from those communities like it was 30 20 years ago, the officers that served the community were those officers from that community, and people were more relatable, had better relationships, and had a better background. Sorry for the noise. A better understanding of what's going on, and I think that reinforcing that again, I think that can help with what's going on. If you're having officers, white officers, for example, in Ferguson, serving a majority brown population, it's going to be tension, and they're not going to have an understanding of culture and interactions. And to reestablish that, and especially in these urban and areas, I think it's an important step that we should start taking.
And I don't even think that it's just
Mhm.
white officers
Yeah.
abusing unarmed African Americans. Honestly, I'm one of those people who think that there's a few exceptions to the rule, and I would think that Sergeant Kaisha Zebedee is that exception. But I think that once you become a police officer, you have this mentality where you're blue and you protect each other first. I witnessed police brutality against an unarmed friend of mine. It was three officers against him, and when I say it was only God's grace that they beat him up instead of me, because I was right there and the situation was like they could have just picked and choose who they wanted to beat up. So I don't think that it's just I don't want to. It has. I think there is. It does have to do with racism. The murders of the murdering of unarmed brown people, but I also think there's just a mentality of police officers sticking together, because if it had not been, I think that more police officers would stand up when they see their brothers and sisters being harmed or assaulted. Um, so yeah, I think that it has to be. I think that you can have really good white police officers and you can have a really good African American police officer, but I think there's some type of underlining perception against brown people that may
No, yeah,
be the reason why we're being
yeah, and I'm
attacked.
not saying that's the case more so, but I'm just saying more people having the community represented in their blue, so that there is that understanding and reestablishing, because I feel like there isn't that going on a lot of times. And even thinking about the states, so going from local to state representation when it comes to having other minorities or people of color in those uniforms, it would be very helpful, just as a starting point, maybe some active efforts
I
by
think
law
that is a
enforcement to have them incorporated in it, because it's not like to see what we're looking at incarceration rates and what type of people are actually getting arrested and put in prisons and jails, to have some active recruitment and have it as another opportunity for the community to take hold of what's going on. I think it could be a starting point.
I definitely think that the community needs to take hold of what's
Courtney, you
going on
make some.
happen.
Oops, sorry.
But so we have about 3 minutes left. So unfortunately, this conversation will have to continue to next week. But I did want Naeem, Kaisha, and Courtney to have some last statements. We'll start with you, Kaisha, since you just started, and then Naeem and Courtney, you can go after.
Okay, real quickly, I will make my points really brief. First, Naeem, I appreciate what you said in response to my comment. And when we're talking about very first steps of most immediate action steps, that's really where I was beginning with the actions of young people and kind of being responsible for their actions when they are encountering the police. We have a long road ahead of us when it comes to educating of our police officers. I'm a big proponent of that, and you will see in next week's episode where we continue the conversation that I talk about, education of our police officers. Courtney, you are right on point when you talk about officers being more representative of the communities that they service. That is so important. It will up the trust level when it comes to community interaction with police officers. And I believe we have a long road, but we can't afford to be desensitized. We can't afford to get overwhelmed with all of these instances. And I want to encourage everyone to, with each one of these instances that continue to happen, many of them are very heartbreaking. I want us to be mindful to filter each one through their individual circumstances, and paint each one by their individual circumstances. We can all work together to change this culture that has been so ingrained. We really can change it.
Naeem?
Yes. Once again, thank you all for having me. I do appreciate it. My closing statements would just be to stay tuned to everything that's going on in your community. I want to shout out the New York Justice League, who actually just completed a march from New York to Washington D.C. Over the past 9 days, from last Monday, not the Monday that just passed, but 2 Mondays before, up until this past Tuesday. So it was a 9-day march where they came from New York to DC, and it's institutions like those, and it's people in these institutions, especially my good friend Paul John, who are actively looking to make a difference, and with people like that who are open to listening, open to conversation, as well as officers like Kaisha who are, again, open to listening, open to changing the status quo, we can do something about it. But we can't be afraid to redefine what it means to be a cop, redefine what it means to be a young black male, and just redefining our narratives as we see fit. So that's all I have to say.
Courtney, really quick in closing.
Yeah, so I'm really excited. I hope you all can join us next week so we can continue this discussion, especially after what the next steps are, which is the next episode that will be airing next Sunday at 7 o'clock on WMSN. So with that, we could talk about what can we do now? What are the next steps really that we can do, and how can we still stay engaged? So that's my closing comment.
Thank you, everyone, for checking out the Sunday Hangout with Naeem, Sergeant Zebly, and Courtney. Please tune in next week for part 2 of this conversation, and good evening.